A man sits in a bar in Tokyo on June 22, 1941. He is a German journalist, well known among the diplomats and military officers who drift through the city's embassy district. His name is Richard Sorge. The radio has just announced what he already knew was coming. Germany has invaded the Soviet Union. Sorge had tried to stop this moment. For months from the other side of the world, he had sent warning after warning to Moscow. He had even given the approximate date, and every single time, his reports had been dismissed. On one of those dispatches, the report was marked as suspicious and treated as possible provocation. In the weeks and months before the invasion, the Soviet leadership received dozens of intelligence warnings that Germany was preparing to attack. The warnings came from spies, diplomats, border reports, and other foreign sources. Stalin dismissed them. The result was a military disaster on a vast scale. In 1941, the Soviet Union would suffer catastrophic losses on the Eastern Front. Entire armies would be surrounded and destroyed. Cities would fall. Stalin's refusal to act on repeated warnings was a major part of the catastrophe. This is the story of how Joseph Stalin's refusal to act carried an enormous cost, and how the Soviet military losses of 1941 nearly ended the war before it truly began. To understand what happened in the summer of 1941, you have to go back to August 1939. That month, to the shock of the world, Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union signed a non-aggression pact. The agreement, negotiated by Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov and German Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop, guaranteed that the two nations would not attack each other. A map of Europe, drawn that autumn, would show the result. Germany took western Poland. The Soviet Union took the eastern half. Later, the Soviet Union also moved into the Baltic states and took territory from Finland. For Stalin, the pact was a masterstroke. He believed it had placed a buffer between his country and Germany, and he was convinced it had bought him time. Time was exactly what Stalin needed. His military was in terrible shape, and he knew it. Between 1937 and 1938, during what became known as the Great Purge, Stalin removed or imprisoned large numbers of military officers. The purge eliminated 3 of the 5 marshals of the Soviet Union and many senior commanders. The damage was staggering. A force that on paper looked like the largest in the world was, in practice, a hollow army. In regiment after regiment, new officers found themselves commanding units they barely understood. Many had been promoted far beyond their experience. The chain of command, from the Kremlin down to the smallest infantry company, was saturated with fear. Officers were afraid to make decisions because the wrong decision could mean arrest or worse. When the Red Army fought Finland in the Winter War of 1939 to 1940, the results confirmed the weakness. Soviet divisions advanced into the Finnish forests and were cut apart by a much smaller force that understood the terrain. The Red Army suffered heavy casualties. Finland was eventually forced to accept terms in March 1940, but the world had seen how badly the Soviet military performed. More importantly, so had Hitler. David Murphy, a retired intelligence officer and author of a major study of Stalin's pre-war intelligence, has noted that the Red Army's failure in Finland was a significant factor in Hitler's decision to launch Barbarossa. If the Soviets could not defeat Finland, how could they stand against the Wehrmacht? So had Hitler. By December 1940, the German leader and his senior military staff were planning the invasion of the Soviet Union. On December 18, 1940, Hitler signed Directive No. 21. It gave the operation a name, Barbarossa, after the medieval Emperor Frederick I. The opening line of the directive was blunt. The German armed forces must be prepared to defeat the Soviet Union in a rapid campaign, even before the war against Britain was concluded. The buildup began almost immediately. By the spring of 1941, about 3 million German soldiers were assembling along the Soviet border. Tanks, artillery, and aircraft were being moved east by rail in a logistical operation of enormous scale. The concentration was visible from the air, from the ground, and from inside the German government itself. And people were trying to tell Stalin. The intelligence started arriving early. British intelligence picked up signs that Germany was planning to turn east. Prime Minister Winston Churchill sent a personal warning to Stalin through diplomatic channels in April 1941. Stalin's reaction was to dismiss it. He believed Churchill was trying to drag the Soviet Union into a war with Germany to relieve pressure on Britain. American officials also passed along warnings that Germany might attack. This warning, too, was filed away. But the most important warnings came from Stalin's own intelligence network. Soviet agents inside Germany, across occupied Europe, and in Japan were reporting with increasing urgency that an attack was coming. From Berlin, Soviet contacts within the German government and military reported on troop movements and preparations. From Prague, one agent sent word in April 1941 that Germany would attack in the second half of June. Stalin called the report in English provocation. Then there was Richard Sorge, operating in Tokyo undercover as a German journalist and a member of the Nazi Party. Sorge had spent years building relationships with senior German diplomats, including Ambassador Eugen Ott. Through these contacts, Sorge had direct access to German strategic thinking. By late May 1941, Sorge was reporting that large German forces were massed along the Soviet border. On May 30th, he sent another message. Berlin had informed Ambassador Ott that the German attack would begin in the latter part of June. Ott was reported to be 95% certain that war was coming. Around June, Sorge sent yet another dispatch. This one included an expected start date around June 15, based on information brought from Berlin by a German military officer. The report was marked suspicious. Here is the key to Stalin's thinking. He was not ignorant of the danger. He simply believed that war could be delayed. He was convinced that Hitler would not attack until Britain had been defeated. He believed that the German military buildup along his border was either a bluff or an attempt to pressure Moscow into further economic concessions, and he was deeply afraid that any Soviet defensive preparations, any mobilization, any movement of troops would give Hitler a pretext to attack. So Stalin issued a standing order: do not provoke Germany. Soviet military commanders along the western border were told not to respond to German provocations. German reconnaissance aircraft repeatedly flew into Soviet airspace, photographing military positions, and Soviet commanders were told not to shoot them down. Philip Golikov, the head of Soviet military intelligence, understood what his boss wanted to hear. Reports that warned of imminent invasion were often treated as disinformation. The entire intelligence system had been bent around one man's conviction that war was not yet coming. Now watch what happens next, on the other side of the border. The final pieces were falling into place. By early June 1941, the German buildup was reaching its peak. A map of the deployment would show 3 massive army groups stretching from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. Army Group North, aimed at Leningrad. Army Group Center, aimed at Moscow through Minsk and Smolensk. Army Group South, aimed at Kiev and the rich agricultural lands of Ukraine. In total, more than 3 million German and other Axis soldiers stood ready, supported by about 3,000 tanks, more than 7,000 artillery pieces, and about 2,500 aircraft. It was the largest invasion force yet assembled. On the Soviet side, the Red Army had about 5 million men under arms, with vast reserves of tanks and aircraft. On paper, the numbers were impressive. In reality, the force was poorly organized, undertrained, and catastrophically unprepared. Many units were in the middle of reorganization. Tank crews lacked training. Ammunition was poorly distributed. And crucially, the forces were deployed far forward, close to the border, in positions designed for a counterattack rather than a defense. Military historian David Glantz, one of the foremost Western scholars of the Eastern Front, has described the Red Army of June 1941 as poorly trained, inadequately equipped, and ineptly organized. Both Hitler and Stalin knew it. The days ticked down. On June 13, 1941, the Soviet state news agency, TASS, published a statement that rumors of an impending German attack had no basis. The statement was meant to reassure. It had the opposite effect. Soviet commanders who were already nervous now received the clear signal from Moscow that preparing for an attack was not permitted. On June 21, 1941, a German soldier named Alfred Wiskow crossed the Bug River near the town of Sokol and surrendered to Soviet border guards. He told them that the German army would attack at dawn the following morning. The report was sent up the chain. Marshal Semyon Timoshenko and Chief of the General Staff General Georgy Zhukov went to see Stalin with the news. Stalin's response was that the German deserter was part of a provocation. But this time, late that evening, Stalin did agree to one limited measure. He authorized Directive No. 1. The order told Soviet military commanders in the border districts to bring all forces to combat readiness, but to avoid provocative actions of any kind. The directive was transmitted shortly after midnight on June 22nd. Most units did not receive it before the attack began. In the early hours of June 22, 1941, German artillery opened fire along the entire length of the Soviet border. Just before 4 o'clock in the morning, the first waves of infantry and armor crossed into Soviet territory. The destruction on the first day was staggering. The Soviet Air Force, one of the largest in the world at the time, was caught heavily on the ground. About 1,800 aircraft were destroyed on the first day, many of them on the ground. Photographs taken later at Soviet airfields show rows of shattered planes, still lined up where they had been parked the night before. German bombers hit fuel depots and communication lines. Soon, the Luftwaffe had achieved air superiority over much of the front. On the ground, the three German army groups punched through the Soviet border defenses with alarming speed. Stalin's orders to avoid provocation had left many units unprepared. Many formations were caught off balance. Officers who had been warned not to provoke the enemy now found themselves trying to organize a defense against an army that had already broken through their positions. The opening stage of Operation Barbarossa on the Eastern Front was unlike anything seen in modern warfare. In the first week alone, German forces advanced hundreds of kilometers into Soviet territory. Army Group Center, the strongest of the three, drove straight through Belarus. By June 28, only 6 days after the invasion began, German tanks entered the city of Minsk. The encirclement at Bialystok and Minsk was the first great catastrophe. German panzer groups swept around both flanks of the Soviet Western Front, trapping the bulk of its forces in two enormous pockets. When the fighting ended in early July, the Red Army had lost hundreds of thousands of men, with estimates varying by source. An entire front had effectively ceased to exist. Stalin's reaction to the disaster was to punish the commander. General Dmitry Pavlov, who had led the Western Front, was recalled to Moscow, accused of failure to perform his duties, and executed. His death did nothing to change the reality on the ground. The pattern of the first weeks repeated itself again and again through the summer and autumn of 1941. German panzer forces would push deep into Soviet territory, swing around behind Soviet formations, and close the encirclement. Soviet soldiers trapped inside these pockets, which the Germans called cauldrons, would fight fiercely, but without supply, coordination, or air support. Most were eventually killed or captured. In July and August, the Battle of Smolensk consumed enormous Soviet losses over the course of 2 brutal months. Here, for the first time, Soviet resistance was fierce enough to disrupt the German timetable. Red Army units counterattacked repeatedly, often with little coordination and terrible losses, but the cumulative effect slowed Army Group Center's advance. German commanders noted with concern that their own losses, though much smaller, were exceeding expectations. Equipment was wearing out. Supply lines were stretching thin. The rapid victories of the first weeks were giving way to something harder and more grinding. Then came Kiev. In August 1941, Hitler made the controversial decision to divert panzer forces from the drive on Moscow and send them south to encircle the Soviet forces defending Ukraine. General Zhukov had warned Stalin that Kiev should be abandoned to save the army defending it. Stalin refused. He ordered the city held at all costs. A map of the encirclement shows the scale of the trap. German armored forces from the north and south met east of Kiev on September 16, 1941, sealing the pocket. Inside it were most of the forces of the Soviet Southwestern Front, under the command of Colonel General Mikhail Kirponos. The Southwestern Front suffered catastrophic losses. Kirponos himself was killed trying to break out. Only a small fraction of the trapped force escaped the encirclement. The Battle of Kiev was one of the largest encirclements in military history. 5 Soviet armies and 43 divisions were effectively destroyed. In a type report filed after the battle, German commanders claimed 665,000 prisoners, and still the catastrophe continued. In October 1941, as Army Group Center finally resumed its drive on Moscow in what was called Operation Typhoon, German forces achieved yet another massive encirclement near Vyazma and Bryansk. Hundreds of thousands more Soviet soldiers were trapped and destroyed. By December 1941, 6 months after the invasion began, the scale of Soviet military losses was almost beyond comprehension. According to figures later published under the editorship of the military historian Grigory Krivosheev, the Red Army suffered about 3.1 million irrecoverable losses during 1941 alone. Other researchers have argued for even higher totals. More than 2 million Soviet soldiers had been taken prisoner by the end of 1941. Many of them would die in German captivity from starvation, disease, and mistreatment. In a type summary of Red Army strength produced in the spring of 1942, the figures tell a grim story. The peacetime army that had existed on June 22, 1941, was gone. Much of the force that had stood on the border that morning had been killed, captured, wounded, or replaced. Now we return to Richard Sorge, the man who tried to prevent all of this. After the invasion he had warned about came true, Sorge's credibility with Moscow changed overnight. Stalin now needed him more than ever, because a second threat was looming. If Japan decided to attack the Soviet Union from the east, while Germany was advancing from the west, the war would be lost. Throughout the summer of 1941, Sorge and his network in Tokyo worked to answer one critical question. Would Japan strike north against the Soviet Far East, or south toward the Pacific and Southeast Asia? On September 14, 1941, Sorge sent one of his most important messages. He reported that Japan would not attack the Soviet Union in the near term and was instead preparing to expand southward, toward British and American territories in the Pacific. This time, Stalin listened. In the weeks that followed, the Soviet leadership began moving fresh formations from Siberia and the Soviet Far East toward the defense of Moscow. Among the forces that arrived outside Moscow in late November and early December 1941 were troops transferred from the Far East. They were trained for severe winter conditions, well-equipped, and fully rested. When the Soviet counteroffensive began on December 5, 1941, these transferred forces played an important role in the attack. A photograph taken that winter shows German soldiers retreating through deep snow, their summer uniforms inadequate against temperatures that dropped far below freezing. The myth of German invincibility had been shattered. Moscow did not fall, but the cost of reaching that moment had been almost unimaginable. The intelligence failures, the purges, the fear of provocation, and the refusal to listen all pointed back to decisions made at the top. Stalin's orders before and during the opening phase of Operation Barbarossa had left his own military dangerously unready. The catastrophe was shaped in large part by decisions made by Stalin, who dismissed repeated warnings from spies, diplomats, and generals. Let us zoom out and see the full picture. In 6 months, the Soviet Union lost territory larger than many European countries. Tens of millions of its citizens fell under German occupation. The industrial base of the Western Soviet Union, the factories, the coal mines, the railways, was lost or destroyed. The economic damage alone set the country back by years, and the human cost was the worst of all. Millions of soldiers were gone in half a year. Families across the Soviet Union received no letters, no word, no explanation. Many would never learn what happened to their husbands, sons, or brothers. The prisoners of war, numbering in the millions, faced deadly conditions in German captivity. Of the roughly 5.7 million Soviet soldiers captured during the war, millions died. Some historians argue that Stalin has been made a scapegoat for larger systemic failures. The Red Army was in the midst of a massive reorganization. German military proficiency was genuinely superior. German disinformation was sophisticated, and many of the intelligence warnings Stalin received had included predicted dates that turned out to be wrong, which made it harder to separate real warnings from false alarms. All of this is true. But the weight of the evidence from archival research by scholars like David Murphy, Gabriel Gorodetsky, and David Glantz points in the same direction. Many historians argue that Stalin received enough warning to justify stronger precautions. The warnings came from too many independent sources in too many countries over too many months to be dismissed lightly. The historian Gabriel Gorodetsky, who used Soviet diplomatic, military, and intelligence archives, argues that Stalin was trapped by his own assumptions. Stalin was not stupid. He was not uninformed. He believed he could manage Hitler the way he managed everyone else, through calculation, pressure, and the careful avoidance of anything that might upset the balance. He was wrong, and in the end, it was not Stalin who paid the highest price. It was the soldiers standing in their barracks along the border at 3 o'clock in the morning, who never received the order to prepare. It was the pilots who never reached their aircraft. It was the tank crews who ran out of fuel on the second day. Millions were gone in 6 months, and Stalin's refusal to act on repeated warnings was a central reason why. Richard Sorge was arrested by the Japanese in October 1941, just weeks after sending the message later linked to the defense of Moscow. He was tried and executed on November 7, 1944, the anniversary of the Russian Revolution. The Soviet Union did not officially acknowledge him until 1964, when he was posthumously named the Hero of the Soviet Union. His grave, marked by a white memorial stone, sits in a cemetery in Tokyo. A photograph of that stone shows a simple inscription. It honors a man who sacrificed his life fighting against war. What it does not say, and what the stone cannot hold, is the weight of the question that follows every intelligence failure. What if someone had listened? If you found this story valuable and you would like to hear more accounts like it, I would appreciate it if you would subscribe to the channel and share this video with someone who cares about history. These stories deserve to be remembered.